Hello, welcome to the Daily Fantasy Flex podcast, the PGA edition. I am your host, Bryan. I am joined, as always, by Colin Davey and Peter Jennings, a.k.a. CSU Ram 88. We are here to talk about the CareerBuilder Challenge in 2018. But first, let's just talk a little bit about last week's Sony Open. Ended up Patton Kizzire getting the win in the sixth hole of a playoff, which I think was the longest playoff since 2012, battling out with James Hahn, who I believe was actually our consensus favorite contrarian play. We always do the top five, or the top player under 5% owned, and I think he was our consensus guy, ended up getting second place. So that was encouraging to see. But yeah, let's talk about last week. We can talk about it through the lens of ownership. We have Gary Woodland, was the highest owned guy at like 36%. So curious, Colin, if we're always trying to measure sort of equity versus ownership. And we've talked about these guys that are like in the 7K range and just massively owned. If you knew that Gary Woodland was going to be at 36% ownership, what would you do with him?
Auto fade, 100%. And that's difficult to kind of like look through a results-oriented lens. But yeah, I had an interesting test case for that exact scenario this weekend where I loaded up on plenty of James Hahn, and this week it was not enough to even get like any decent cash across the board. So that's got me evaluating a couple different spots. So the first natural one was I pivoted to Lovemark instead of Gary Woodland across the board because it was something like, a third less owned, or I should say like 12% ownership versus 36. Even swapping in Gary Woodland for Jamie Lovemark, saying, okay, like Lovemark didn't make the cut, would that have been enough to move the needle? And the answer is no. So I think there are other factors at play here. The big one I'm wondering about is the big thing about the Sony Open is that it's such a birdie fest and such a relatively easy course to other courses. And I know we've talked about how does that change your decision? And that one I'm still going back to the drawing board on. Maybe in a birdie fest, you just need people who make cuts more than or maybe the contrarian payoff just isn't there and you need 6 out of 6 no matter what. I'm struggling to figure out and kind of look at why didn't the Hahn lineups do well? Obviously, the math dictates they don't do well, but as a strategy, it's like, okay, what else do I need? If loading up on Hahn and a contrarian second place finish isn't enough, what else do I need? And this is specific to this tournament. Pete, I'd love to hear your opinion on easy courses. Do you ever trade off a little bit more upside for cut making, knowing that you just have to get 6 out of 6 across more than most tournaments?
It's a common question every week. It's frustrating when you don't get 6 or 6 through, and that's what you need when you hit on someone like Hahn. That was kind of the way my week worked out as well. Lovemark missing the cut was very costly, but yeah, I mean, I do think that in general, you're trying to figure out a way to optimize for upside while still making sure you have, the best chance to get the most guys through the cut. So, in majors last year, one thing that I thought was interesting that worked out was playing kind of the chalk cheap guys and then going contrarian at the high end. I wonder how that's going to play out this year. I mean, obviously it worked last year. I don't expect it to work nearly as well this year, but I do think when there's some low-end cheap guys that are just very clear values, sometimes it's probably okay to eat the chalk if they're making the cut, let's say 80% or 75% versus your other options, which are making 50 to 60. But it's not there's no exact science, I think. I think that's the challenge and the beauty of DFS golf is it's dynamic to every tournament and kind of every situation. But to answer your question directly, when there's more of a birdie-making opportunity, obviously it's critical to get the 6 of 6 guys through. So maybe you weigh cut making just a little bit more, but I don't know. I definitely don't have conviction either way. What do you think?
I would probably be willing to trade off either some upside or ownership or, zag a little bit less from the field when they're zigging. In a birdie fest, especially when the cut gives you that much more leverage. I think this week is almost it's an interesting one to talk through because on the surface, it seems like a similar birdie fest condition in that we have the cut round after 3, but also it's kind of the opposite in that since everyone gets 3 rounds, an extra round doesn't give you nearly as much leverage. So maybe you need to go even more contrarian. because like the gap between cut and no cut isn't as strong, and maybe ownership is at a higher premium.
So does that make like finishing position more important?
I think so, yeah. I mean, that's the only way. I don't know if it makes finishing position more important. I think that's definitely true for harder courses where there are less birdies. But I think it actually makes ownership a lot more important, because like there's just so much like clustering at the top that the only way to really get into the upper echelon is to really differentiate yourself.
Yeah.
So it's kind of a third dimension. We talk about equity ownership trade-off a lot, but there's kind of like this freaky third dimension of how does those decisions change on birdie fests versus the U.S. Open.
Yeah. The metagame in PGA DFS is so interesting. Something we'll talk about all year long. Before we move off of this and get to the career builder, I did want to touch on that strategy that you had mentioned last week, Pete, which was, paying for the chalk in the lower end, like Gary Woodland. We knew he was going to be chalky, maybe at that level, like in the 333, like the high stakes tournament on DraftKings, he was nearly 50% owned. But I think, Pete, you had mentioned like the majors, when there's so many top end guys, like you can really get an ownership discount. I'm curious your thoughts on like whether last week was an anomaly or whether you could even do that in a tournament like the Sony. Like, so Jordan Spieth in that 333 was 41% owned, and Justin Thomas was 13% owned. So even with two guys, it seems like there was a clear public favorite, and like there seems to be an edge there, even with only like two studs,
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think that's the key. I mean, I prefer in a big way to go contrarian with the studs versus the cheap guys. I mean, I think that it's just very clear, like at any point in time, any one of these top 5-10 guys can go out and win if they have their A game. And a lot of times, like let's say you get a distance course, right? Like everyone's going to load up on Dustin Johnson. And, you might be better off going with someone like Spieth, where they're not, getting a huge edge versus the field with their distance. Obviously, he's still somewhat long, but everyone's going to load up on like the super big-time bombers. So I think there's a ton of value in kind of going away from course fit, especially with the studs, even course history with the studs, which I do think is really, really valuable. But if you can get a huge ownership discount, that makes a big difference. I remember a couple of years ago, I got Jordan Spieth like 2% in the Thunderdome, where Jason Day was like 50%. And that's when Jason Day was just playing out of his mind and everyone was on him. So that's where I feel the best about being contrarian, but by no means have I done a great job of this outside of maybe some high stakes tournaments where I think I have a decent gauge of ownership. The middle tier is the struggle. Last year we saw Adam Scott be uber chalk a ton of times in the majors.
Paul Casey too.
And pivoting away from those guys in certain situations made a lot of sense. So it's going to be it's definitely the art of the game, which makes it fun, and the game's always changing. So hopefully we'll be able to identify good spots to take advantage of that. But for sure, one thing I have a lot of conviction on is pivoting away from the chalk at the very high end. And I do think the low end guys, especially in some of the majors, you're just getting so much equity on the guys that I think I'll be getting those guys in, especially in tournaments like the Thunderdome or high stakes where they pay out 20% of the field. And the Millionaire Maker, like a winner take all, you can just basically fade all the chalk and feel good about it.
Yeah. Cool. Good discussion there. All right, well, let's get into the Career Builder Challenge. One just quick show note before we do that. It's the new podcast in 2018. We're looking to build it out. Do some different things. So we're going to try some new segments here and there, but also just looking for your guys' feedback on what you're looking for. We are thinking about maybe doing some contests where you guys play against us on DraftKings, like a user field. But just feel free to shoot us suggestions and stuff on Twitter, either to our personal accounts or at Fantasy Labs Golf. And we're excited to see what this podcast is going to be in 2018. All right, let's get to the Career Builder Challenge. The tournament's in California. Like Colin mentioned, it is a thing that has a 54-hole cut. So that's sort of an interesting dynamic there. Also interesting dynamic is that it's played at 3 different courses. They're all sort of the same length. They're within the 150 yards of each other, all par 72. So Colin, I think we should start talking about the courses. Is it a situation where you can just sort of aggregate the data, or does this just introduce a lot of noise?
I think the only thing you can do is aggregate the data and say, how does the round or how does the tournament play out as a whole across all of the golfers, across all of the courses. This one is also a particularly interesting one because there is some history here, and the tournament does go back a while back when it was the Humana Challenge after they changed sponsors. But 2 years ago, they changed the last course they play from the Arnold Palmer PGA West course to the Stadium PGA West course. So there is a course change. So it is kind of an open question about how much of course history is applicable prior to 2 years, given that like some of the courses are the same, but the last course is a little bit different. To try to answer that, I did look at fit in years past a little bit. There's a little bit of similarity. As far as history, maybe a little bit muddled, but the one thing I can say with confidence, even though all the courses are pretty different, is that it does set up pretty well for Bomber's course. Everything being a par 72 is not that surprising, given that PGA West is pretty long. It's not surprising you want to load up on distance. It's a pretty moderate fit. It's not, say, like Torrey Pines level of fit, but I'm pretty comfortable targeting Bombers here and saying that they do better here. So yeah, just have a little bit. I give course history, maybe all else being equal, like since 3 of the 4 courses are the same, 75% of the normal weight as kind of a dumb heuristic.
Yeah, Pete, what are your thoughts on that? It's getting a little buzz. You know, people are trying to figure out exactly what to do with the different courses, but they do seem to at least be somewhat similar.
Yeah, I mean, I think you still have to look at it a little bit. Obviously, it's not as impactful as if we have the same exact course, but I think it's something that we're still looking at. One interesting thing that I'm curious your guys' opinion on is golfers who play well kind of early in the year. Not sure that's really a trend we can buy into, but I've heard some guys talk about it. You know, you watch the Golf Channel, they're like, oh, this guy starts off hot, he plays well in January and February. I think that's somewhat interesting to think about this week. I'm not saying it's very predictive, but maybe in terms of ownership, people might be taking that line of thinking. And I think in general, people might not be cognizant of the change here at the course. I think the hardcore guys will be. But Colin, any opinion on that? Like, have you noticed any seasonality trends for some of these golfers? One trend that I definitely believe in is a guy like Paul Casey's played really, really well at the end of the year. And I think it's more likely that that could be applicable for some of these guys, you know, in the end of the golf season where they're just clicking on all cylinders. I could buy that narrative a little bit, and specifically Paul Casey does stand out like that. But any thoughts on the beginning of the year narrative, and how are you treating this course?
I mean, I like all of those narratives. I treat it as guilty until proven innocent. I think figuring out if a particular player is good under X conditions is kind of like the same debate we have over, like, does the win player exist? Anecdotally, you can think of like reasons why it would, but it's extraordinarily difficult to prove generally that if someone has done really well in a specific subset of conditions before, that's repeatable. When in regards to seasonality and early versus late, that's an even tougher one because how often it's one thing because to get you can get a pretty robust sample size of something like wind over a bunch of different tournaments, but like early in the year versus late in the year, you're now looking at a golfer's January performance, and like that's like there's so many other things going on over like a multi-year time sample that is really tough to isolate like the part of seasonality. So I treat that with honestly more skepticism than other narratives. I'm open to it just because I can't measure it doesn't mean it's not real. But what would help in that case is like maybe some underlying narrative or explanation of why someone would do better early versus late. And that gets into the danger of almost like target hunting, right? Where like I think if I ask most people to do that, they would look at who does well early versus late and then backfill a reason for why that's true instead of starting with a hypothesis and trying to see if it's true or not.
Yep, I agree. I think it's overrated for sure. I would love to look into it a little bit more, but have heard stuff like that on the Golf Channel. And I think, you know, obviously the golf guys love to buy into all these narratives. It's great content for them to talk about. So we obviously want to take a more data-driven approach, but it is something interesting, especially for ownership. And I do think that's one other thing. that I'm hoping to be a little bit better at this year. I think I did a decent job last year, but even better this year is just really paying attention to all the other mainstream golf content, especially for the majors, because that's going to drive ownership. I think we get caught up in our bubble, which especially during weeks like this, it does matter a lot. You know, the DFS golf community is driving ownership in a big way, but when we get more, you know, recreational money, paying attention to the broader golf content, I think is an edge we can take advantage of this year.
One more question about the course before we get into the players. Colin, I'm not exactly sure how to phrase this question, so try your best to follow me. Since there's so many like different holes this week because they play on different courses, is there any like narrative to, you know, like think Jordan Spieth at Augusta? Like the dude just knows the course so well. So are there players, do you think, that do better when they can like really, really scout a course? Versus players who are more adaptable in the fact that there are 72 different holes. So you really just have to go off, like you just can't scout it well enough. So I'm not sure if you've ever looked at like players, like which players do better on holes that they see repeatedly versus who like does best on like holes they've never seen before. But do you think there's any narrative that just like there's so many, it's like a hard tournament to like really scout ahead of time?
Sure. I guess like the corollary narrative I could buy into is if you have a caddy that's really good at taking notes and devising strategy and like I'm sure there's absolutely a tactical element to golf in general. And I would believe that some people are better tacticians than others. Cue that clip of like Phil and Bones talking back and forth and the Golf Channel collectively losing their minds like it's the Battle of Waterloo or something. But yeah, I think that's one of those things where it'd be a lot tougher to measure, but like I'm open to it existing. It's just I wouldn't like even begin to fathom to try to reliably say like who's like you're essentially asking who's best going in blind, right? Right. You could look at maybe something like how does everyone do in the majors where everyone's going in blind, but like that's a whole other animal because they're majors.
It's a major,
you get like confounding variables like motivation and like cover fields and all of that good stuff.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. One to maybe think about as we move on here. All right, let's move to the players. We'll start with the top end guys and then move our way down. Yet again, we have 5 players who are in the triple-digit price tags, led by Jon Rahm. He is 11.8 on DraftKings. We have Brian Harman, 11.5, Patrick Reed, a little bit below that, and then rounded out by Kevin Kisner and Phil Mickelson right at 10K. Pete, I'll start with you. Break down the top group. Who is standing out to you among those 5?
Sorry. Well, for me, it's pretty easy. I definitely want Rahm exposure here. I mean, he's someone I'm going to be buying a lot this year, I have a feeling. At the top end, I think he has a chance to push to be number 1 in the world sooner rather than later. And when you look at who he's compared to, you got Phil Mickelson, obviously getting older. You know, did show some signs last year, but hasn't won in forever. Brian Harman, who's definitely playing really well, but not in the caliber of golfer as someone like Jon Rahm. He is playing amazing recently, so you'll be buying his current form. Then you got guys like Kevin Kisner, Patrick Reed, Webb Simpson, Snedeker. I mean, I just don't see anyone in the tier of Jon Rahm, and you'd have to pay for him, but he, to me, is like far and away the guy I want to spend up for. The only challenge there is the ownership. I could see him being by far the most heavily owned given the kind of name value that he has. Colin, do you think Rahm is a clear-cut top-end choice? And if not, who are you pivoting to? And if you do think he's the clear choice, who do you think are some good alternatives for tournaments, considering we probably think he's going to be heavily owned?
I do have Rahm as the clear-cut favorite. Definitely sets up well for this course. I mean, it's really close between him and Harman because of that ownership question. I mean, the X factor with Rahm is that people do love to play him. His ownership, I mean, this is like approaching Ricky levels of fandom where you can just constantly count on it being high. I think Harman is pretty much the only conceivable pivot to ownership, and it's a question of how much equity are you giving up. I have 2 factor aside from ownership, which like is the primary one. There are kind of 2 tiebreakers that kind of push me where I could see myself in a little bit more Harman. One, Rahm hasn't played the course, and Harman has really good history, an 11 and a 3 here in the 2 times that he's played. And two, this is a little bit of a hot take, is that Jon Rahm's, like, depending on how you categorize upside, Jon Rahm's might not be as good as one might think in terms of expectation. Like, there's just this stretch like midway through the year where with someone of his caliber, he just blew a lot of opportunities to make top 25. That looks to be changed as of late, or is definitely on the upswing. So that gets into this kind of meta concept of, we've talked about recent form and we've talked about upside like separately. Now, like, the combination of the two is, do you think recent upside is a thing versus regular upside? And that's one where I think the jury's still out. And how do you compare like overall upside versus recent upside? So I could talk myself into Harmon, but if I have a tendency, it's definitely to talk myself into more contrarian, lower ownership side, all things considered, because I just believe you can never have enough low ownership.
Well said. So who do you guys think is going to be the lowest owned of this group? So we have Rahm, Harmon, Reed, Kisner, and Phil. Just early look at our projected ownership, which will change based on new data throughout the week. But it looks to be Patrick Reed right now. Colin, would you agree with that?
Yeah, I would, and I think it's for pretty good reason. I get why he's there, and he has like not terrible upside, but there was just that stretch, aside from like a one recent finish where he kind of justified his price tag. There's just been way too many disappointing results, especially considering the caliber of his competition. Just like the middling results in the European Open, Bridgestone is middle of the pack, BMW, he just kind of gave up. Even just HSBC among the class of the field, like, just showed nothing. And then a miscut at a gimme event, essentially. Just there's a lot to not like to kind of drag down his long-term and even recent adjusted round scores. People just don't also like playing Patrick Reed. Like, that's just kind of like, he doesn't garner the ownership and kind of fan popularity that a lot of other players do. Is it worth a pivot? Is the ownership going to be low enough? Is the equity still there? Gut says no. And I don't think I'll get a lot of pushback from that one on Pete, but let's see.
No pushback. It's just a tough range. I mean, I think this is like a classic spot where obviously I just talked about how you want to pay or you want to be contrarian at the top, but I just am struggling to find someone that I think makes a lot of sense. Probably the way I would go if I want to be really contrarian here is maybe just fade the top range altogether and go more balanced and maybe lead, with like a podcast favorite like Brendan Steele, or go even farther down and lead with someone like Ches, another podcast favorite, and try to build a really good lineup with guys kind of in that 9K range. But in terms of the high end, I'm really kind of focused on Rahm and Harmon, and that's looks like they're probably going to be the most heavily owned of the group. So, I need some sort of stance here, I guess. What do you think about leading and just fading all these guys altogether, Colin?
I think you could get there. I think like if you built around something like a Kisner-Mickelson combo where they're both kind of in the same range, like that's.
What about fading those guys all together and like having your most expensive player being like 10K or something, 10-2 or something?
Yeah, that's like it really depends on if you think that Rahm and Harmon have an overwhelming amount of equity that like they become like it becomes more difficult to fade them. I could see that being the case this week where they're approaching that. I think as always, the X factor will really be ownership as far as like how everyone else likes it. It also depends on if the value guys end up getting higher or lower owned, because if people are going to pay up for Rahm, you're going to need some sub 7K guys, and it depends on who has general confidence in them, yes or no. It'll be interesting since Harold Varner is usually the go-to in that range. He missed the cut last week, and so are going to people be a little bit more off of him.
Colin, how do you some questions that I get is like, how do you deal with a guy who has like a lower long-term adjusted round score compared to like his price? So like, for example, Brian Harmon is really priced up at 11.5, and he's going to be popular because of his course history here. But if you just look at his long-term adjusted round, he is 12th in the field. I mean, guys like Brendan Steele are right there with him. Jason Duffner, even like Zach Johnson, Lucas Glover have superior scores to him. So I guess there's like a line there where you have to measure course fit and course history, but it seems like Rahm, like he has a far superior long-term adjusted round score. Like that's got to matter at the end of the day, right?
Yeah, absolutely. That's the fundamentals. I think the cheap answer to that is a lot of those prices reflect something like a recency bias. I look at someone like Patton Kizzire, who was like well below 8K last week and is at 9,100 this week. Does anyone really think he's a generally 9,100 player? Probably not. That's just his odds getting boosted because he literally just won last time. And it's arguably the same thing with James Hahn, who could have just as easily been the winner. He was like mid-7s last week. Now he's like low 8s. He's not that different, like generally, I think, from Jason Kokrak. Like they always seem to be close to one another, and Kokrak's price didn't move. I mean, but I don't think a single tournament should change your price by that much. So yeah, I think that reflects the fundamentals and kind of like the long view.
Yeah, for sure. All right, let's dive into this lower range here. We'll go from guys below Phil, so guys in like the 9-8K range here. Pete, I'll kick to you first. It seems like we have some interesting guys. We talked about Ches. If you start building with some of these guys in this range, you can get up to some of the 9K guys. But it seems like there's some interesting value in this range as well. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's some interesting value here. I think there's some, super high upside plays. Someone like a Grayson Murray at 9.2. We saw some huge flashes from him last year, as well as some absolute utter disasters. So you have guys like him. Then you have the polar opposite at the same price tag, a guy like Kevin Na, who's just uber consistent, did play poorly at the Sony Open, so maybe that'll bring down his ownership a little bit. Not poorly, but he missed the cut. Then you get into some of these, guys who I think are up and coming, and I'm curious, where Colin stands on someone like Austin Cook, who, if you look in the models, he's just been absolutely ridiculous because he's hitting so many greens and he's played extremely well in general. So you have someone like him. You got a variety of guys that I think are just really, really interesting overall in this range. I mean, I personally am trying to buy some of these young guys at the right time. I'm curious Colin's opinion, mostly on Peter Uihlein, Cook, and maybe, I don't know, I'm trying to think, like, we still have the same guys in these range, like Charles Howell, who's going to be uber consistent, probably not going to win for you. Hudson Swafford, who we've taken a lot in the past. Maybe we should analyze that a little bit more. You have someone with upside a little bit lower down, like Luke List. Colin, what are your thoughts in general with this range?
All right, so just cover everyone in 2 minutes or less. Yeah. I think they're all, you could talk yourself into any one of them for any number of reasons. I think like Ches is an interesting case where he's not a good fit, but kind of has like history to make up for it. So it's kind of canceling out. Brendan Steele, we always seem to talk about every week because everyone has struggles to get on the right side of him. Austin Cook he'll always be the confounding factor for me because I missed him the first time isn't noise. If you're on a GIR tear, is that sustainable? He is like by far the one that is over delivered on his upside relative to anyone else so far. So like that just jumps off the page if you believe in upside. Maybe it's overcorrecting and maybe he's just like breaking the concept of upside. But like, I mean, yes, he is playing well. Like, no, that just start with that premise and like no one's denying it. I think I could talk myself into any one of these guys. I think the one name that we haven't mentioned so far that's kind of sitting like right in the middle of the pack unnoticed a little bit is Bud Cauley, who I struggled with a little bit last year, especially since he was coming back from an injury and he got priced up way higher than I thought was justified for a while, kind of regressed a little bit. But I think mid-8s is about the right price for him. Fits it moderately well, has positive history here. I just feel like I'm going to go with, in this range, whoever doesn't get touted or whoever's odds don't significantly jump since that drive ownership so much. And that could really be anybody. I think if I had to guess who's going to get recommended a bunch, it's probably going to be Howell. If there's one, I know we just talked about cup making a lot in like the importance of it in birdie fests. But the one narrative I could believe is like people maybe like I could buy people tend to overvalue cut making for the purposes of winning a GPP, just because having someone miss the cut is so scary. And if there's kind of a base emotion that people respond to more than anything, it's fear, right? You're just so afraid of not getting anyone across the cut line. And so you're like willing to overpay or like over own Howell just because like, oh, he's the one guy that I can count on, right? Well, that leads to an ownership inefficiency. So you'd have to be willing to pay for him because like it's so hard to get into the top 1% that like you have to zag at some level. So I can always talk myself into a Howell fade for GPPs anyway. Cash is a different story. But I think that makes sense. I don't know, like Pete, I know you played Howell before, but like so like I don't know if there's a disagreement there.
No disagreement. I mean, Howell's ridiculous in terms of his money won on tour. Admire the hell out of that. But in terms of winning a GPP, he's won like 2 tournaments in his career. So as long as he's been on tour and as consistent he's been, he just doesn't seem to crack the winner's circle very often. But he's a solid play, definitely more of a cash game play than a tournament play for me.
Yeah. One thing I want to do is include some of the betting market into this podcast moving forward. So looking right now at some of these like one-on-one tournament matchups, one that's standing out to me, Colin, I'll kick to you first on this one, is Charles Howell versus Jason Dufner. They have the same odds. So Howell and Dufner are both at minus 115 to beat each other. But then you look at their price tags, and Jason Dufner is at 9.8 and Charles Howell is at 8K. So that is an almost $2,000 difference for what the betting market says is like 2 even golfers this week. Is that meaningful to you at all?
Yeah, that's an interesting one. That kind of gets you into upside versus consistency. The weird part is Dufner is known for being consistent as well. I basically agree with a dead even line there. I don't think Dufner is a 98. That's because I don't think Dufner is a 9,800 player. I think he's closer to like an 8,800 player. And I think Howell has a little bit better fit here to kind of make up the gap. Dufner isn't like great on distance, all things considered. But yeah, that's an interesting, I think the easy explanation for that is Dufner's price probably reflects more of his upside than his consistency. And so that's something I wrote about way back in the day, explaining how you can get those discrepancies between odds to win and head-to-head matchups. One guy just has a much wider range of options, but like their average outcome is about the same. So that's, I guess, more of how to not get tripped up by that information. But yeah, it is like that's the stuff you have to parse when you really want to incorporate the betting markets into your decision process.
Yeah. Pete, would you agree that, I mean, it's hard to sort of talk about these terms, but like a guy with like big upside, but maybe a little more volatility is maybe overpriced for cash games, whereas a guy like Charles Howell is underpriced for cash games consistently just because his upside is not reflected in his salary?
I do. I mean, Kuchar is like the classic example of that, right? Like you look in these, tournaments, especially in majors, he's way down there. He's probably not going to win, but he's probably going to make the cut and be consistent. And maybe he's too big of a name relative to some of these other guys who are just grinders. But yeah, that's what you want to do. I mean, you want to take the grinders who are really consistent and may not flash that same upside in cash and, fire in all the, super high variance guys in tournaments. You still need some upside, obviously, in cash games. Your goal is to win those cash games still, but absolutely. And I think that's a nice thing about DFS golf too is, you can eat the chalk and cash and really go away from it in tournaments, which gives you kind of a nice, portfolio of players to, cheer on throughout the weekend. So that's one thing I think is really nice about golf. It sets up nice for hedging. And obviously I'm a pretty big fan of getting different exposures and, you can go all in on a guy in tournaments and not have any exposure to him in like leagues and cash.
Yeah, that's a great point. All right, let's dip down to the value plays. Colin, it was sort of an ugly tier last week, but this week in like the 7K range, we do have a lot of pretty big names. We have guys like Lucas Glover, who always stands out in our models. We have Snedeker at 7.7. We have guys like Adam Hadwin, Luke List. So it seems like talent-wise, the 7K range is a little better than it was last week. Who's standing out to you?
Probably number one with the bullet is Kevin Chappell, who it shouldn't be too much of a surprise. If I know I'm weary on odds per dollar being the end all be all, but I mean, like he's basically priced at like a mid eights, or he has the odds of a mid eights and the price of like a mid high sevens. Um, I've been high on him as of late. I feel like I seem to mention him a lot. History isn't great, but the fit is definitely there, and doesn't kind of have the drag down of the upside that other people do. Speaking of which, like Luke, once I'm like since I've started to reevaluate my concept of upside and like top 25 potential for all these golfers, like there have been a lot of guys who I've mentioned in the past. I'm definitely reevaluating this year. Hudson Swafford is probably the poster child, which is especially confusing considering he did win a tournament last year that I know like that was a good week for Pete as well. And B, he's a tall guy, so he kind of seems like, if you're just looking at a golfer, maybe you conflate like height with upside because there's power there that doesn't go away and it's not like subject to as much fluctuations. But he doesn't seem to hit top 25s as much as someone should for, his level of, his distance and kind of like what we consider that upside should be. And Lucas Glover is kind of the same way. He's definitely a great ball striker. And that's something that if you're high in GAR and recent GAR, you definitely want. But for some reason, he just doesn't hit top 25s as much as he should. It's kind of a weird thing because there's no explanation about why he does or does not. And is it repeatable or not? Or is it predictive of future top 25s? Yeah, I think it is to some degree. If you can just say that a guy consistently misses expectations. What I think is more interesting to unpack is why someone wouldn't hit a top 25. You can do all sorts of mental narratives. Like it's tougher, like once you're in contention to kind of stay there. And some people do better than others. Maybe there's a physical fitness element to it. But I believe Glover is one of the more fit guys in tour and takes exercise a lot more seriously. So but I don't know. Maybe I'll kick it to Pete and just say how's your view of upside changed and what are some explanations for why some people would or would not have it?
Mental aspect has to be a huge part of it. And then just, raw talent as well. Someone like Lucas Glover just can't putt. So that, especially as the nerves start to get up there in contention, stuff like that seems to go even more. I think this range is pretty tough this week in terms of upside. There's some guys that I'm interested in. Seamus Power, someone who's ranking pretty high in my model. He's been very volatile. Not sure what to do. He's very low owned last week and obviously had a pretty good finish. Didn't hit a ton of greens, and his stats overall aren't that great. Before that, he missed 2 cuts. He's someone that's ranking high in my model that makes me a little bit nervous. I agree with you on the Chappell call. That was the one guy that really stood out to me. I think he's going to end up being really chalky. It's tough. I mean, I'm not really seeing a ton of guys that I'm just like in love with playing. At the high end of the low tier, you have some guys that have really nice name recognition, but have just really kind of fallen off. Like Ryan Palmer, 2 years ago at this price would have been just like a slam dunk. And maybe he still is a decent play, but obviously he really played poorly towards the end of last year. Sony Open finish wasn't awful. His stats were okay other than his driving accuracy. He is capable of bombing it, but the other things that we have here recently are 2 missed cuts and just I think he's been injured too. So I'm struggling with this tier. That's why I'm kind of interested in some of these balanced lineups overall because I like a ton of the guys kind of in that mid-tier range.
Cool. All right, let's talk about guys that are standing out at low ownership. So we'll go, projected ownership around 5%. Who is standing out as a guy that you were interested in that range or a little bit lower, Colin?
I'm going to stick with my up-and-comer bet, like under the radar, Aaron Wise. Missed the cut last week, doesn't have history here, but if there's a place that plays well for it, it's long right here. So I definitely think he has the fit. The fact that he did so well in college is just something that I know isn't priced in. So we talk a lot about pedigree and how like that might influence if there's anything like that doesn't show up in the stats. all else being equal, it's better than some of these other guys have. And I think like he is just waiting to pop in the same way that Xander was about this time, maybe like 6 months ago. So I don't know when it's going to happen. I'm just firmly convinced that he has the best chance of doing so. And I'm going to continue to ride him while his ownership is low.
Pete, what are your thoughts on that call? And then a guy that's standing out to you. You had mentioned Power, who I think is going to be really low, so I'm not sure if that was your guy.
Yeah, I mean, I think he's fine. I don't have a lot of conviction on that. Obviously, that Colin call is like something right out of my playbook, taking the young gun who's done really well as an amateur or college player. I certainly am always trying to buy those guys. So I like that call quite a bit. Looking at ownership right now in terms of guys that I think have a chance, I really like Luke List. I think he'll probably be a little bit higher than 5%, but I love the course fit. His driving distance, I think, will be really nice. Talked about Grayson Murray. He'll probably be way higher owned than 5%, given the volatility, but the high upside that he possesses. Sean O'Hare was someone I was playing a decent bit last year in driving distance spots. Not sure I love him this week, but he definitely fits the ownership mold in terms of a bomber. And then the one guy who has just been awful lately that I could see playing well at some point is Robert Garrigus. Colin, you can just totally destroy me if you think this is egregious, but here's a guy who has serious power. And last year he was either great or awful. So for tournaments, I don't hate that, but curious Colin's opinion on Garrigus in particular.
I mean, at like under 2% ownership, like no, I'm looking as far as if I really want to get down lower ownership, like they're like everybody around him, I could not like for a million reasons. Like the only other one that I would like maybe compete with that I would slot in instead would be someone like either Andrew Landry, but there's just such sparse history there that you never know. Sam Saunders has potential, but his history is awful. Martin Flores, but just like doesn't really do any particular one thing well, and I don't know if he has like great upside. Yeah, I don't hate Garrigus. The only one I do hate in there is Luke List, which is interesting because we went back and we talked him up a bunch, but I think it's another case of Hudson Swafford, where if you actually look at all the time he should hit all of his top 25s, he just doesn't. The Puerto Rico Open comes to mind last year, and like that like effect has persisted.
Yep, we were all in on Luke List, Puerto Rico Open. All right, well, that's someone I'll have to look back on. I just think when I think Luke List, I think upside, but that's, again, maybe where I'm biased and should look at the data more.
Yeah, I think that's a really, like, the data really does show a different story there.
Yeah. Well, one guy that I prefer, I think, right at his same salary on DraftKings is Jason Kokrak, who has poor history here. He missed the cut 2 years ago, but has been playing well and has the distance. Colin, would you prefer Kokrak over List?
Colin Kokrak.
Sorry, I was trying to struggle on mute. Yeah, I prefer Kokrak over List for a million reasons. Kokrak and Hahn are just going to be joined at the hip for me forever. I'm just going to be pushing this boulder up the hill forever, apparently. It almost worked last year when I had both of them, and it kind of worked this week, except like kind of had half of it. But yeah, I don't know how to quit Jason Kokrak. Let's just bring it full broke back.
Yeah, hit value in 9 of his last 10 tournaments, and seems to at least be somewhat set up well for this course. So we'll see how that goes. Projected for around 5% ownership. So, all right, let's end it with our picks. I think Pete went first last week. I think I went third, so I'll take the top pick. I know that's it looks good for me taking Rahm here, but Colin, I'll let you go second, and Pete, you can go last. So I'll take Rahm. Colin, go ahead.
I'll take Harman.
Great.
You like how that's set up, Pete?
Yep, that was a nice little setup there for you. Patrick Reed is such a chump. I don't want to take him. I'll take Kevin Kisner.
Yeah, there's a lot of equity, I think, with Rahm and Harman there at the top. And then let's go under 9K.
Okay. I will take Brendan Steele.
That frees me up for my homer pick, Ches. Give me Ches.
I like it. Yeah, Ches is a good call there. I'm going to go Bud Cauley. That would be my pick.
That's a good one.
Yeah. All right. Thank you guys for listening or watching as always. Again, please send us feedback on what you guys want to hear, whether it's more talk about the betting market. I think we're going to do some more podcasts talking about some futures and stuff for the majors upcoming. Obviously talk about some young guys that we're in on, but any thoughts on any segments, or if you guys want to do a DraftKings tournament together, we're happy to do that. Send us feedback on Twitter. Good luck this week. We'll talk to you guys next week.